My name is Kate MacDuffie. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Washington and the Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics and Palliative Care at Seattle Children's Research Institute. I've sort of taken a winding path to get here. So my background, I studied neuroscience as an undergrad, and then I did my PhD in clinical psychology. And then I sort of feel like I've combined both of those things in my current career, which is in bioethics, where I really study the social and ethical impacts of advances in neuroscience research. So very much draw from the things I learned as a neuroscience undergrad and the things I learned, the methods, in particular research methods as a clinical psychologist, to do the work in bioethics that I do now. Yeah, it looks like this. I feel like I mostly work at my computer.
Yeah.
It's sort of non-technical, the research that I do, in the sense that it really can all just be done on a laptop. Most of my research methods are surveys and qualitative interviews. So qualitative interviews are exactly like what we're doing right now, except with usually people who are participating in neuroscience research. So I do interviews with them, I ask them about their experiences, if there's any sort of ethically challenging aspects of the experience, we tend to really focus on that. And then we take the audio recording of it, turn it into a written transcript, do what's called qualitative coding of that, and that's how we analyze our data. And then we write it up in papers, we write grant proposals, we present at conferences. I have a small lab of research assistants and graduate students that I work with. And so, yeah, that's how we do it. I think pediatric bioethics is inherently super interesting because there can be a lot of people who have different opinions about what's in the best interest of an individual child. And with adults, people over 18 have autonomy to make their own decisions in most cases, but children don't. Someone else has to be the decision maker for them. And in some cases, parents, doctors, researchers, they might all have different ideas about what's right for that individual child. So it just sort of lends itself to more ethically complex situations, I think. Plus, I just happen to love kids, and so working with a bunch of people who also love kids, I work with a lot of pediatricians. It's just a nice environment because we're all thinking about what's best for kids. This is work that's thinking about people who donate biospecimens of blood or skin cells to create brain organoids, which are in cellular models of the brain that are grown in the lab. And I've done a bunch of projects looking at actually children who've donated biospecimens for brain organoid research, sometimes when they're quite young. So it's not something that they are consenting for because they're 2, 3. Their parents consent on their behalf. But that brings up some really interesting questions because the kinds of cell lines that you can create from a donated blood sample from a 2-year-old, for example, that cell line can be kept in the lab for an infinite amount of time. And so 20 years down the line, researchers could still be growing brain organoids from that same cell line. But the question is, at that point, the child has grown to their own independently consenting adult. So one of the focuses of some of the interviews I've done with parents is really thinking about, at the point your child donated the biospecimen originally, they were far too young to participate in an informed consent conversation. But given that their samples might still be used by the time they're 18, what is researchers' responsibility for sort of re-engaging the child that's now become an adult and getting their permission even for continued use of their sample? Yeah, well, in a way it's related to the idea of reconsent, but one of the things that we heard so consistently across these interviews is that people who donate biospecimens for this research, whether they themselves donated as adults or whether they're parents who consented on behalf of their children, they just really want to know how their samples are being used in research. And typically the way that this is done is you do a one-time donation of a biospecimen and then you sort of never hear from the researchers again. And what I heard over and over again is we want to know, both because first of all, we're just curious. Like, we oftentimes people donate for this research because they're interested in science, they're interested in research, so they just want to know what happened because they're curious. But also, really importantly, because they recognize the fact that the science is growing really rapidly, that there are things that could be possible in the future that we don't even know about right now, and they want a way of sort of being able to check in and making sure that they're comfortable with the way that their cells or their child's cells are used moving forward. And so that's something that my group is really thinking through a lot now, is how could we set up a system for ongoing engagement of donors in this kind of research so that they could get that information from research teams and feel more engaged in the process over time. Yeah, there's a lot of interest in bioethicists are very interested in how AI is going to impact the healthcare system more broadly. My work is not so related to that. I would say in my day-to-day, the way that AI has been most impactful is thinking about how to use ChatGPT when doing our academic work, right?
Yeah.
Like, how you look things up, whether you trust the results enough. I actually was quite proud. I stumped ChatGPT writing my most recent grant application. It actually gave me we just don't know. We can't tell you anything about that. So okay, I guess that was a hard question then. So I think the kinds of questions that everybody who does academic work is grappling with in terms of how to use generative language models, how to, in the sort of publishing ethics, like now when you submit a paper to a journal for publication, you have to say basically ChatGPT did not write this. So I think those kinds of things tend to be how it's most impacted me. I think there is lots of ways in which AI has potential to change how basic scientists do their work, and given that I often collaborate with basic scientists who create the organoids, that will have implications. And then, as I mentioned, people are really interested in how AI is starting to integrate more into the healthcare system in terms of analyzing medical record data, having chatbots interact with patients via MyChart. I mean, all sorts of things are really just starting, and so there's a lot of bioethics interest in that for sure. So one thing that has come up in many, many projects that I've done is this basic question about people who participate in research. They want to know the results of the research they participate in. And it sounds like kind of a small thing, but when you think about it, a lot of times people participate in research because they want to help. They want to contribute to science. But if you never learn the results of the research you participate in, you never know really how you've helped or whether you've helped, right? You just sort of put your data out there and then you never hear anything back. And so this feels particularly relevant in the situation of brain organoids, as we've already talked about, because that's an area that the technology is changing really quickly. People have a vested interest in sort of making sure that their samples are being used in a way they feel is ethically appropriate over time. But I think it applies really to all research across the board. And there really isn't a standard practice for researchers to give results back to the people who participate. You have all sorts of reporting requirements, like to your funder, NIH, for example, at the end of a study. There's now requirements that you actually make all the data that you collect in a research study publicly available. But in those open science efforts where we are trying to expand sort of broad accessibility to the products of research, there actually hasn't yet been any focus on directly giving results back to research participants. And so this has been something that I've been trying to think more about, which is sort of how can we support researchers in that process of just taking the simple step at the end of a study to say, hey participants, thank you so much again for your time. Here's what we learned. Here was the value of your contribution. And I really think it's a way of demonstrating respect and reciprocating the effort that they put forth in helping to contribute data. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, a lot of brain research is focused on solving problems that can occur in brain development. And I've been really interested in, a lot of the work that we've talked about is parents who have a child with a neurodevelopmental disability, for example, and those parents have an interesting perspective. Obviously, they're a decision maker for their child. But then those children grow up to be adults who have neurodevelopmental disabilities and are, functioning members of society. And so I've been really, it's been very important to me to incorporate the voices of those participants in my work. And so whether it's adults with autism, for example, adults with other genetic disorders that impact brain development, making sure that their voices are included in my qualitative interview studies. I have a patient advisory board that has a number of adults who are impacted by neurodevelopmental disabilities, because again, they might start as children who are not able to consent, but those children grow up and they become people who absolutely should have a say in terms of how their data should be used, and how they interact with research teams. Yeah, I think about the brain and the mind all the time. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and watching her language development on a day-to-day basis and sort of how she makes associations between concepts and how her memory is just starting to develop is so endlessly fascinating to me. And I mean, I think everybody finds those things interesting, but I have been very grateful to have the sort of neuroscience training that I have, that I sort of understand things about how memory works. And so as her memory starts to come more and more online, I can really see it happening in real time, and it's just super interesting. I mean, I just really commend you all for the work that you're doing to communicate neuroscience findings in an accessible way. I feel like that's a thing that I also feel quite passionate about, because I think science can sort of happen in a silo, and public trust in science right now is at a pretty low point. And I think a big way to remedy that is to just improve communication about what actually is happening, in places like the University of Washington and Seattle Children's. How do scientists think about these things? What motivates them? And how does science really work? Another big thing that motivates my interest in how to share results with research participants is exactly the same purpose, that we need to just increase how people understand how science really works, because I think over time it will build trust and help people really understand that how science can benefit them and all of society. So thanks you all for the work that you're doing, for sure.
That wraps up the questions. If you have anything that you want to ask, please jump in here.
I don't think I have any other questions.
Okay.
Yeah, you did a really good job.
Yeah.
Answering all the questions.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course, thank you guys.